So in 2015, when Chinese President Xi Jinping made his maiden visit to Pakistan, he announced to the world the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Standing beside him was the then Pakistan Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Xi Jinping hugged Nawaz and declared that Pakistan and China were iron brothers. Of course, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, China pledged to invest something like $50 billion and develop the port of Gwadar in Balochistan province into a world-class city. Cities like Dubai or Singapore or even Shenzhen. Cut to 2021, the experience of the CPEC as well as for the experience of locals in Gwadar has been rather different. There have been month-long protests in Gwadar and in other smaller towns across Balochistan province, not just against the CPEC project, but also against a whole host of issues which the locals there are aggrieved about. Topmost, in fact, of their demand is the ban on deep-sea fishing. Now, there are trawlers, many of them come from China or belong to Chinese marine companies, fishing companies. They indulge in deep-sea trawling off the coast of Gwadar in the Arabian Sea. This, the locals there have taken grave offense to. So they've seen unprecedented protests over the last month or so. Initially, it was led by the fisherfolk community, but then later on it was joined by other members of civil society in Balochistan and also, most importantly, women. Women turned up in huge numbers for these protests against the Chinese government, the CPEC project, and of course, the fact that locals there feel that they are getting shortchanged. So how did the story of Gwadar, which was to be the next Dubai or Singapore, go from that promise in 2015 to this reality in 2021? So when CPEC was launched and Gwadar was announced as the crown jewel, or this town that's going to be completely transformed by Chinese investment there, even many ordinary Pakistanis were taken by surprise. After all, they had a big port. In fact, the biggest port in the country, Karachi, is not too far away from Gwadar. So why were the Chinese interested in developing this big-ticket port in the middle of nowhere, in a dust bowl of a province called Balochistan, which anyway has had issues with the Pakistani state? In fact, for a number of years, the Balochis, indigenous Balochis, have wanted to break away from Pakistan, have asked for some form of independence. Also, there were concerns about interference from Iran. Remember, Balochistan shares a long and extensive border with Iran. There are lots of families in Balochistan who are divided, who have their relatives on the other side of the border in Iran. So there are a huge number of Iranian Balochis as well. And there are familial linkages which the Pakistani state has been suspicious about for a number of years. So why did the Chinese choose Gwadar of all places? Now, if you look at China, its development experience, its phenomenal reform and opening up process over the last 40 years has brought about an uneven development experience. The eastern and southern part of China, the entire coastline along both the South and East China Seas, have seen huge amounts of development. The cities there across the east and southern coast of China are comparable to modern-day Western cities. But that level of development has not happened in the western provinces, namely Xinjiang and Tibet. Now, one of China's big concerns is, as it develops its east and south, A, there is this differential between the eastern provinces and the west, and B, the other big paranoia that China has had is that what happens if a war or even a limited war were to break out, God forbid, whether it's on Taiwan or whether it's on any of the multiple island disputes that China has. And again, interestingly, all of China's island disputes are on its east or on its south, whether it's with Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, they're all towards China's east coast or its southern coast. And that is also where a bulk of China's ports are located, and they use one route through the Malacca Straits. In fact, 90% of the world's commerce goes through the Malacca Straits. And if, God forbid, there were to be a war in which China is one of the principal protagonists, then shutting off the Malacca Straits, whether it's for the US or its allies or any of the countries, shutting off the Malacca Straits would be rather easy to do. What this would mean is that it will put a huge pressure on China's import and export channels through the Malacca Straits. Like I said, a large amount, a disproportionate amount of China's trade happens through the Malacca Straits. And China, of course, is the largest trading country in the world. It's the second biggest economy. So in this quest for Western routes, the closest port that they could think of, which of course has to be in a friendly country, in this case Pakistan, was Gwadar. So when they made that promise back in 2015, it was to transform this small dust bowl of a town into a world-class metropolis, into a world-class port city. Unfortunately, what's happened for China and for Pakistan over the last 6 years is that the local Balochi people, like I said, first it was initially just the fishermen, but even after that, the local population there, the Balochi population, has felt aggrieved, has felt shortchanged about the CPEC for two reasons. Number one, a lot of the jobs are being taken away, either directly by Chinese people who are employed by Chinese companies, the high-end jobs, the skilled jobs, and the lower-end jobs were being taken away by other Pakistanis who were coming from other more populous provinces, namely Punjab. So the fear in the local population, some of which has come true now, is that they're getting shortchanged, they're not getting jobs, they're neither getting the high-end jobs, nor are they getting the low-end jobs because it's being taken away by quote-unquote outsiders. So that is one big fear. Second, the CPEC, right from the day it was announced, had become a target for Balochi terrorists, for Balochi insurgents, who felt right from the get-go that this was against the interests of the Balochi people. So there have been numerous attacks on Chinese companies, on Chinese nationals. And then just earlier this year, there was the infamous attack that happened on the Dasu power plant, again in which more than a dozen Chinese nationals were attacked and died. And that became a huge diplomatic flashpoint of sorts between Beijing and Islamabad. So for these two reasons, the promise of Gwadar has not met the reality of what the city is today, or what the province is today. Now, these protests that have been happening in Balochistan over the last 1 month or so were led by a man named Hidayatur Rahman. He's a Maulana who heads, interestingly, the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is an ally of the ruling government of Imran Khan. It has always been a party that has sided with whichever party is in power in the federal government in Islamabad. So this man, Hidayatur Rahman, in fact, has been leading a group called Gwadar Ko Hakuk Do Tehreek, or Give Gwadar Its Rights. This is a movement that has now encompassed civil society there in Balochistan, and they had been out on the streets protesting. They had a list of over a dozen demands. The main one was to have some kind of check, restriction, ban, if you will, on deep-sea trawling. Like I said, a large number of these deep-sea trawlers were that of Chinese companies employing Chinese nationals, and the local fisherfolk there were afraid that this would just eat into their livelihoods, it would eat into their produce out at sea. So the protest was so vociferous, they were so widespread, so much so that the federal government in Islamabad, the Imran Khan government, took note of the protest, had no option but to accede to this one demand. There are a whole bunch of other demands which the federal government has said that they will consider, but they haven't given any outright assurance. But this main demand of some kind of a check/restriction on deep-sea trawling, that's been accepted by the Imran Khan government. So suddenly, Hidayatur Rahman has become this huge hero figure for the Balochis. They've realized that they can put pressure on the Pakistan government. Of course, let's not forget, elections are due in Pakistan in 2023, and the Imran Khan government wants to ensure that there are as few pockets of resistance, as it were, across the length and breadth of Pakistan. The question then, we go back to 2015 and the promise that Xi Jinping made about the CPEC being a game changer. Remember, the CPEC is a central part of the Belt and Road Initiative. This, of course, is Xi Jinping's pet project. It's a dream project whereby he wants to diversify China's trade routes. He wants to diversify China's shipping routes. And if CPEC were not to go through to fruition, then the very BRI, the very Belt and Road Initiative itself, could be brought into serious question.